We'll now check out the different clay brushes in ZBrush. We have 3 different clay brushes. We have the clay brush, which is found under B, C, and L, just called clay. We have clay tubes, which is found under B, C, and T. And we have the clay buildup, which is B, C, and B. The one I use by far the most out of these, and by far all the brushes in ZBrush, is the clay buildup. This is really one of my favorite brushes, and we just have to talk about these 3 brushes in particular. The way we use this is a bit different from some of the other brushes we have. The reason is because this builds up a lot of volume, and it can be really rough when you're first getting into it. So you can see here that we have clay buildup, we have freehand strokes, and we have the square alpha. And this is what happens when we start to just sculpt with it like so. And you can see it just keeps on building up. And this is a bit more of an advanced brush than something like the standard brush or inflate brush or something like that. And the reason is because it just requires a bit more control of your hand. And that's something which will come with time. But when it comes to sculpting, this is not just a purely theoretical exercise. You're not just going to go, yeah, I read this documentation, I know the hotkeys are cool, now I understand how this works. This is more like using a pencil. You can be using a pencil wrong for like 10 years and then suddenly you realize how to use it and everything kind of comes together. That's a bit the same with these brushes. So when it comes to this, I very rarely actually use it as default like this. And the reason is because it's a bit hard to control. I mean, I said you have to learn to control it, but let's make it easy for ourselves. There's no reason to have an extra challenge. So the way I do it is first I go to the alpha and then I change this to alpha 06. And you can see this gives me a brush which is much, much softer. We can also disable it entirely, and this gives us a really nice and soft brush. I tend to go between this version of it, just with no alpha at all, and the version which just has alpha 06 to it. The reason is because it's really easy to define actual shapes this way, but without getting really into the texture of it. Like you can see we get some texture, but this is the perfect amount of texture for me. It's like the texture we're getting here is really nice and organic, which means that if you're doing something organic, you can really use this to create something nicer. This is what we talked about in the appeals video. You see here how we have almost a bit of overlap right away, just because of the texture of the brush. So it's kind of like we can work up some shapes like this just by looking at the texture, and you just get something far more organic. I very rarely use the smooth brush at all in ZBrush, and the reason is because I have so much control with this brush. The way I'm using it is I keep going up and down in size as well, so I can really get in and get like sharp details, or I make it super big and I use it with a low pressure of my hand to get these big shapes like so. We can also hold down the Alt key, which will carve in as well. So this is how I'm often using it. I'm holding on the Alt, and then I'm using a heavy pressure and then a light pressure. Let's say we want to soften out this edge. You could, of course, use a smooth brush like this, but you see it's never really going to get soft. It's just going to get like really blurry and nasty. So what I prefer to do is I prefer to work across the shape, and that's using this technique. This is like where you're cross-hatching like this. So imagine every one of these, every single mask stroke now is a stroke. That's what we'll do. So we can go over it like so. And you get a lot more texture this way, but you also have a lot more control. And here you can just see I just went up in the size as well. So this way you can really refine the shapes you're working with. If this method to you is just disgusting, if this makes no sense to you whatsoever, try it out and see if this is something you like. If it still doesn't make sense, just work with whatever method you prefer. There is no right way of doing it. There are only rules, there are only tools, no rules. So whatever you prefer. But now you can see that we get these really nice organic shapes just by using the clay buildup brush. We can also go in and just set the intensity really low. This is what I do. I usually start with something like 20, 25, and then I'm going in and I'm working up the shapes with a lower intensity. And now you can see that I'm not holding on a shift key or anything for smoothing. I'm only working up the shapes with additive, meaning I'm not holding on the Alt key. And you can see how refined these shapes are. Maybe this shape here is like an eye or something. completely freestyling now. Hold on the Alt key now just to refine this shape a little. And you can just see how we get so much interesting shape work going on just from working with this technique. And if we have to get rid of all these brush strokes, which we of course do, you don't want brush strokes in your final model, at least if you're doing something for production, then we'll just reduce this even further. Something like 2 is something I actually work with a fair bit, where I'm just getting it really low and just working over and over and over and over. And eventually you'll just see that these brush strokes will just disappear. But what they'll leave behind is shape. They're not just going to be blurry. They're going to be soft, but they're going to be soft and defined. There's a huge difference between something being blurry, which is just non-defined. It's just like a mess of shapes, between something being soft. You can have this when you have maybe a photo or a painting where the lighting is incredibly soft. It's not blurry. You still see exactly what's going on, but the lighting is just very soft and comfortable. That's kind of the same thing we're going for now as well. Soft shapes, but defined shapes. So this is a really powerful way of working, because you can essentially do your entire sculpt this way. And you just get lower and lower and lower in your intensity, which is fantastic. This is really the way I'm working. And then we have another brush, which is far more brutal. This is the B, C, and T, which is the clay tubes, which we just briefly talked about. This is a brush I use a lot where I'm doing maybe like the primary stages of design. When we worked on the design for the Mega Kaiju for Pacific Rim 2, this is the one I used all the time, because in that case we just needed a rough shape. We needed like big, solid, clean shapes for it. So this is fantastic, because now you can see we can create these really, really rough shapes. Like, this does not care about subtlety at all. This is not a brush if you want to get like the fine details. This is a brush you use when you want to just add volume and just add planes. You can hold on the Alt key to go in and really add planes as well to it like this. This though for me is too strong. Like, there's too much texture in this, so I have a bit of a hard time actually controlling it, which is also why it's perfect, because it means you do get a lot of these happy mistakes. Like, maybe now we're doing some kind of sci-fi paneling or something, or whatever it might be. We can get a lot of happy mistakes because it is so crazy uncontrollable. So I really recommend going over with this brush as well and just going a bit crazy. One thing though I prefer is to go to stroke, modifiers, and roll distance. Now you're going to see if we set this from 1 to something like 7, we get a much cleaner stroke. So if we just undo what we just did now, just holding the Control Z key, and let's just go back to this. And now you can see that the stroke we're getting is a lot cleaner. So it doesn't have all that crazy texture to it. We also don't have that much control with it in this sense, but it provides a much cleaner stroke than what we had before. We can also go under the stroke, modify, and modifiers, and roll distance, set this in something like 2, and then we get like a mix between the two. So this is a good way of doing it if you want like good clean shapes, but still kind of messy. Maybe you are doing something more stylized for sculpting. I don't mean in like the Pixar way, but maybe in terms of like a more naturalistic sculpt or something like that. But it's supposed to feel like it's made out of clay. Then this is fantastic, because this really allows you to get this nice clean clay feeling of it. Now I'm just holding down the Alt key and alternating between holding down the Alt and not holding down Alt. And you can just really see how clean the shapes are becoming and how organic and nice they are in terms of like this really crazy clay feeling. So if you want to make your model feel like it's made more out of traditional clay, I highly recommend using the clay tubes brush for this. Or in the early phases of a sculpt, where you just really want to block in the volumes and not worry about anything else. Then we have the last brush, which is B, C, and L. And that is the clay brush. This is kind of like a mix between the two. This is the difference between this and the clay buildup is that it's kind of a name. It doesn't build up. The clay buildup builds up, and this doesn't. So here you can see we can sculpt and we can just keep working over the same area, and it only gives us volume to a certain level. So this will never ever actually build up. So I'm still sculpting now. And this is great because here we can just do strokes like this, and we know that it's only going to be of a certain level. We know for a fact that this is never ever going to actually sculpt up. So we have a lot more control with this in some way. So I don't use this brush a whole lot. I used to before the clay buildup brush was added, but it's still a fantastic brush for making your model feel more organic. You can really see that you're getting a lot of organic feelings with this. The difference between this and the clay tubes is really that the clay tubes has like a really hard alpha to it. There are some other settings as well, but in general, those are like the main things. This one here it's like a really soft and nice brush, which you can really use even if you're doing like final production modeling. You know, you won't going for realism. You don't want to look like this. You don't want it to look like a clay sculpture. You can totally use this brush for that. And like before, you can also set intensity lower and lower, just so we can go in and we can just refine it. The sculpting technique is a bit different from this brush to the clay builder brush, and this is just something you just have to get used to. You have to do a lot more strokes. You just have to go over the model a lot more like this and build up the volumes, because you do not get any buildup for free just by hovering over it. But that also means that you have a limitation, and limitations can be really good. So those are the 3 brushes for clay. We have BCB, which is the clay buildup, which I use all the time, usually with alpha 06 or no alpha at all. Then we have BCT, which is clay tubes, which is this crazy brush where you can really make it look like it's clay. Go under stroke, modifiers, set the roll distance to something higher than 1. And then you get this really nice and slightly cleaner result. Then we have B, C, and L, which is the clay brush, which is like a mix between the two.